What does it mean to change the world? This is a question that runs through the heart of Persona 5, mostly by means of its leading characters struggling to fulfill the core purpose of their group, even as they continue to amass influence and scrutiny. These disaffected teenagers, tired of the corruption and hypocrisy of the world around them, make use of their special power to enter people's minds and effectively force their redemption, bringing about a typically dramatic confession to previously unaccounted for crimes. But let's think about this for a moment. Is that really appropriate? It's not hard to make the argument that such forceful methods constitute brainwashing. What right do these young men and women, still in high school, have to choose who gets targeted? Should their group actually exist, let alone without any real oversight? And even if pitfalls are avoided, is it right for progress to be made with these methods to begin with? Because in this setting, progress is made. Those who are outside the reach of the law are brought to justice, and in the process, countless victims are saved. From those abused by Kamoshida to those targeted by Kaneshiro to more than a few members of your own party, civilization is better off for your taking action, no matter how extreme it was. Perhaps the best way to summarize the morality of the Phantom Thieves is in the third possible line the protagonist can give during his time in the television studio. They do more than the cops. And here, they do. One can hem and haw endlessly about the efficacy of the thieves, but this does nothing to solve the systemic or criminal corruption that they challenge. In fact, if the established authorities had acted competently or appropriately, it is fair to say that the Phantom Thieves would have had no reason to form in the first place. But not only does the establishment continually fail to address corruption, the average person fails as well, even when they are in a position to do something. The students and faculty of Shujin Academy alike look the other way in spite of Kamoshida's blatant abuse. Yusuke outright defends Madarame before you directly intervene, and that's to say nothing of the game's later antagonists. The ordinary fail, repeatedly, and only the Phantom Thieves are in a position to enact justice. This, perhaps unintentionally, provides an additional inverted note of murkiness to the moral quandary mentioned earlier. To flip the earlier questions around to their inquirer, are the Phantom Thieves in the wrong for taking action in such a setting? If evil would never be otherwise addressed, is it truly of greater moral importance to respect the rules, even if it means doing nothing and letting it continue unabated? Can it really be called morality then? This invites further questions on the issue of governance and justice as a whole, and perhaps unsurprisingly, it's not discussed in any significant manner in-game. Sure, Ryuji wants to be famous, but this never translates to any substantive action on his end beyond the occasional complaint. Sure, Ann asks if they're doing the right thing, but then the conversation moves on in about 2 or 3 lines, without exception. Mishima's potentially interesting deviations are resolved more or less instantly, and no one in your group beyond Akechi have meaningful disagreements on an ideological level, unless you count Morgana's jealousy-driven sabbatical from the team. Which I don't. For most of the story, explorations on this topic are pretty lackluster, but they do come roaring back in a far more meaningful capacity in the game's finale. Yaldabaoth, the god of control, judges that humanity has repeatedly demonstrated its failure to act when free, and that it would be better if he took matters into his own hands. If the world proves unequipped to handle evil on its own, if others wish for a savior, he will step forward himself and do what is necessary to prevent ruin. If this sounds familiar, that's because it's exactly what the Phantom Thieves have been doing the entire game. Don't believe me? Well, let's first look at the methodology at play with the Prison of Regression. Here, the palace rulers repent for their evil, acknowledging themselves as one of many, no more important than anyone else. To put it bluntly, they learn humility, and understand the damage that their selfish desires cause to others and ultimately themselves. In this system, anyways. They say they have been freed of the burden of thinking for themselves. And if you think that's problematic, do you think that they thought for themselves when you forcibly changed their hearts? Of course not. You stole their freedom to self-determine, because they were using it to harm and destroy others, and that was presented as being entirely appropriate. Why should this be any different? Functionally speaking, the results are the same. Perhaps this would not have been the case if, under the former paradigm, they were seen again in the story, working for their redemption in some way that they don't hear. But that doesn't happen. They just disappear from the plot, almost as if they were thrown in the garbage can. Not too dissimilar from this, if you ask me. Now, maybe you've already realized some of the implications of your decision to quote-unquote steal their heart, So as an addendum to this, do you think these men would have repented if left to their own devices? People like Kaneshiro, Kamoshida, these people who coexisted with the social and legal systems at work during the time of the game, were you wrong for your actions up until now? No. Even looking into motivations, it's possible to draw parallels. At this, people are undeniably scoffing at their screens, filling their monitors with spittle and saying to themselves, did this person even play the video game? How do you put these cool kids on the same level as this huge evil robot that wants to rule over humanity? How indeed. Here's my reasoning. The explicitly stated goal of the Phantom Thieves is twofold: to protect the innocent and to fight against corrupt adults. Which, by the way, am I the only one who was a little amused how they kept using the word adults? It's like they're all part of a singular amorphous collective. Is there some club I don't know about? Do I have to pay a monthly membership fee? Rent certainly isn't covering it. I thought it was amusing, anyways. Regardless, they want to protect the innocent and fight against corruption. But what about Yaldabaoth? What about the driving force of the conspiracy, who manipulates you from the very beginning and gives Shido the means to ascend politically? First of all, everything that Yaldabaoth does is to demonstrate the incapability of the world's people on the whole to behave justly, as well as the moral rightness and necessity of his intervention. That is the underlying purpose of his game. Otherwise, why would he even bother with it in the first place? Why risk giving you the means to gain power and oppose him? Why not just invade the world immediately? He's clearly in control of the Velvet Room from the beginning of the game, and no one could have stopped him then. So why do all of this? Because there's more to his character than the will to subjugate. This should be apparent just from his discussions with you throughout the game, where he discusses and identifies the sins of those you bring down. There is an element of sport to it all, but there's something else as well, a moral purpose hinted at by his character and the subject matter he chooses. He's making a point. And unless you believe that he directly gave all the villains their internal motivation and personally absolved the populace of all moral ownership even in the earlier portions of the game, his point for the most part still stands. His power does enable the conspiracy through Akechi. But let's be real here for a minute. Even without his influence, Shido would still have been a cruel opportunist seeking to climb the political ladder, along with likely everyone else involved in the conspiracy. More definitively, Kamoshida would still have been an abusive figure, ignored by those around him by virtue of his celebrity, and Kaneshiro would still have been a criminal targeting students. Are we supposed to believe that without Yaldabaoth, all these people would simply be powerless or irrelevant? Is it really that simple? I think not. But that's just a few bad apples, the saying goes. You can't use them to make a generalized judgment on the people's character. What of the masses that are imprisoned? What about those guys? Well, disregarding the fact that they want to stay imprisoned, consider what most of them were like in the rest of the game. Aside from being completely, in some cases willfully, useless in addressing corruption, they also, steal money from the elderly, try to bully others out of business, create a meaninglessly toxic work environment to appease their egos, blame and financially exploit innocent women for the death of their children in a display of cartoonishly over-the-top evil. All among other things that, again, are implied to go unaccounted for without your influence. And this is just what gets put through as requests. It is not only the major targets that are monstrous in this world. These are terrible people, to the point that you actively have to change their souls to make their redemption possible. Yaldabaoth did not place evil in the hearts of these men and women. He just made it a little more apparent. All to make his point. And to what ends did he do this? To what ends does he strive for power? It's easy to forget given the way he's presented, but the creature known as Yaldabaoth was born from the collective desire of the people for social order. Now, it's easy to point out the flaws in this, but for the moment, ponder the other side of things. Why people would want order, and more specifically, why normal people might want it. Not masked demigods flitting about magical palaces, but normal people. To that end, it would be helpful to examine the confidants. These people represent a range of positions within civilization. They're your best window into it throughout the game. Teachers, doctors, business owners, children, it runs the gamut. Many of these people are just trying to get by on a day-to-day basis. Some are trying to redeem themselves in the eyes of society. All of them wish for a productive and edifying existence that's appreciated by others. And I don't think anyone would condemn them for that. This is the positive side of social order. Peace, and all it entails. It's not like the masses would want it for nothing. Optimistically, the Confidants are like most people. Pessimistically, they're better than most people. But that doesn't really make much of a difference for the point I'm trying to make. Because, you see, something else unifies the Confidants you meet in this game. Every one of them has a serious problem that both weighs down their lives and is, more often than not, centralized in the actions of one of the awful people described earlier. Awful people in positions of power who, like Shido in the beginning, got a hard-on for meaninglessly making someone else's life less pleasant. It's actually rather stunning how widespread the flagrant immorality is in this setting. But that's not the most important part of this. The soul of drama is in conflict, after all. And in any story, what matters most is how the other side reacts. So, what happens? How do the Confidants deal with these disgusting abominations when they show up and bare their teeth? Here's the crux of it. They don't. Yeah, that's right. When evil appears, these kind but otherwise normal people shrivel up and have no response. Sometimes they try to assert themselves, but it is for naught. You have to save them, every time, by going into the metaverse and forcibly changing those that oppress them. Because what would they do? What can they do? Oya's boss has the authority to increase her workload, and unless Takemi has concrete evidence of the more well-established Omaida's wrongdoing, she can't really expect to build much of a case against him. Sometimes, there's simply no practical means to rebel. And if the afflicted do stick out their necks, there is always the risk of it failing, and only resulting in further damage. As seen with Kawakami. Or, taking things further out, the case of Ryuji and the students with Kamoshida. They refuse to confess to the abuse going on, because he would likely deny it, get away, and destroy their academic future in return, all from behind the safe veil of ill-gotten celebrity. You might call it cowardice. They would call it not being an idiot. I would call it cowardice. Regardless of the label, the end result is the same. From moral or logistical failing, injustice prevails, its practitioners escape notice, and the people suffer. Until, of course, your use of the metaverse saves them. The implication here seems to be that it is only through supernatural intervention that the world can be made a better place. And that is a very dark thought indeed. Yet, is it really worse than having no power at all? Is it really worse than things being left as they are? Perhaps, if people were shown as being capable of overcoming these challenges through more mundane and attainable methods, this grim dichotomy wouldn't be an issue. But it is. The only true exception to all of this is Toranosuke Yoshida, which is significant enough that I feel it's worth a mention in and of itself. In the entire game, he is the one person who does not need you to save him. Kawakami does, your teammates do, Futaba needs you to fix her shit 3 times before it sticks. But even though he is also a victim in all of this, the victim of political subterfuge, Yoshida digs in his feet, keeps trying, and yes, ultimately saves himself on his own power. He actually demonstrates the virtues that the game is probably trying to promote, and we should all take a moment to appreciate that. Bravo, Toranosuke Yoshida. The party member confidants would count, if you didn't have to save them beforehand from the palace leaders. But, if Madarame hadn't changed, nothing in Yusuke's confidant story would have happened. And if Kamoshida never left the picture, Ryuji would likely have never made up with the track team. You still had to save them for the personal improvements seen during their side stories to occur. This doesn't make that development any less meaningful or rewarding to watch, but it does show that, in this setting, supernatural intervention is typically necessary for it to happen in the first place. None of this is to say that good people don't exist. Yaldabaoth himself acknowledges them during the final battle. Indeed, there are many upstanding citizens. However, they merely take the sole path before them. All too often in this setting, the majority have no choice but to bow to those that have corrupted the social order for their own monstrous desires, to the point that it comes to dominate their lives. And if you compare them from the beginning of their story to the end, it is fully apparent just how meaningful and miserable this dominion is. They've been disregarded, disgraced, and in the process made cynical, at times outright callous, to those around them. In this setting, even their potential for good is destroyed. And really, what can better be described as ruin than that? Now, there's actually an interesting contradiction that plays out near the end of the game with regards to ruin as a concept. Lavenza states that Yaldabaoth's idea of ruin was his control and reformation of the world, but during the final battle, Yaldabaoth himself declares that his control will not bow down to ruin, clearly presenting them as different concepts. And so, we're faced with a conundrum. Who's right? What exactly is ruin? I hinted at an answer earlier, but does that fit best with the story as a whole? This is an important distinction, because it influences just about every major line of dialogue that Yaldabaoth gives throughout the game. Is he saying that humanity cannot avoid his control, or that they cannot avoid the consequences if he doesn't take control? Did he say that you failed to bring change for some absurd non-reason born of his manipulation after Shido, or for the reaction of the masses throughout the game as a whole? Is he saying it's his duty to kill them, or that his duty is to purge them of the sins that will actively lead to their ruin? Now, both a removal of the subject and a removal of the subject's undesired characteristics are accepted definitions of the word, with the latter bearing far more significance in the context of this game. It's not impossible to look at things that way, or even necessarily unreasonable to. It all depends on one thing. Is Yaldabaoth truly malevolent, as Lavenza states? To answer this question, let's begin with examining the first interpretation, that Yaldabaoth is deliberately ruining the planet. Of course, this is what the Phantom Thieves jump on in the true ending path. The world looks pretty scary anyways, and because eternal peace doesn't sound bad enough, they also corroborate the idea that he's destroying the people too, before chastising him for not guiding them instead. And then they say he acted only because he was worried about the reaction of the public from their actions. Okay, for starters, that last statement is blatantly false, at least in the way they're clearly intending it. Think about how the public reacted to you throughout the game, before the incident with Shido. They at first denied your existence, but then quickly realized what was afoot, and then treated you like an attack dog, as entertainment, a vessel for their own built-up, impotent frustrations with the world. A means to bring down the rich and successful, for being rich and successful, far from the moral intent of reform the Phantom Thieves envisioned. They were not inspired by your example. They just demanded you do more and more ridiculous stunts without thought for the consequences, and then pretended as though they were always against you when it became unfavorable, like Peter with Christ. It's despicable, and it's all you see from them. The thieves themselves even acknowledge this trend when it emerges. So saying that their reaction worried Yaldabaoth because the people were starting to stand up for themselves is simply preposterous. Remember when I said the Confidants were optimistically like most people and pessimistically better than most people? This is a point for the pessimistically column. Their wish itself may be understandable, but their approach to it leaves something to be desired. Imagine if Yaldabaoth hadn't done anything, if Shido's punishment had gone through as planned. What do you think would have happened? Would the people have abandoned this toxic sentiment on their own? No. They would have been emboldened anew, and continued to push their demands, their moral obligation, their outrage, their indolence, on you. Maybe they would have purchased some merchandise and called it a day. In this way, Yaldabaoth's actions after Shido's change can be seen as less a matter of deliberation and judgment, and more one of sentencing. He has seen enough of the people's character to come to an informed decision. And can you blame him? Can you honestly say that his criticisms are invalid? But that's what the true ending is for. Yeah, we'll get to that eventually. For now, let's just acknowledge the fact that as it stands, without supernatural influence, the general public in this setting is terrible and unchanging, even in the true ending. And that's just awful. Anyways, the idea that Yaldabaoth feared his power would be unnecessary owing to some organic change in the people over time is a flawed one. The only way it would work is if he was worried about how they were reacting in a negative sense, that the public's reactions throughout the game further revealed their incapability to improve or address evil on their own going forward, which lends itself to an idea of ruin independent of Yaldabaoth himself. But what about when people were literally bursting into plumes of black smoke? What about when Yaldabaoth directly orders your execution? Doesn't this prove that he's a malevolent entity? Here are my thoughts. For the first object, the assumption is that he's killing them here, and that's understandable. It looks pretty grim. But is he actually killing them? To begin with, that idea is largely born from the assumption of the party and its seeming physical relation to what occurred with the Phantom Thieves themselves, the general gist of it being that they disappeared from cognition and therefore lost any place in the world. But this can't be what's happening. During the scene itself, the people clearly see and remember those who vanish. At some point, one person calls out for their friend who disappeared as well. They haven't been written out of cognition. There is still a place for them in the world. Compare and contrast this with the scene where the Phantom Thieves themselves vanish, and the citizens walk around without a care in the world. The difference is night and day, and it's fair to say that between them, the thieves have it worse. So then, if they're not disappearing from cognition, what's he doing here? Well, you'll notice he only starts doing this once the citizenry starts to panic from the thieves' influence. In all likelihood, he's simply taking them to a different part of the prison of regression, in whatever capacity it still exists, to preserve the social order and stem the tide of chaos. The chaos that you're responsible for. Now, you might say that's pushing it a little, but we've already seen that people can be transported into the metaverse beforehand, even unknowingly. And that's technically what Yaldabaoth did with the Phantom Thieves themselves anyways. Is it that ridiculous to suggest he's doing something similar here? After all, he's the one behind the Metaverse Navigation app to begin with. And if he didn't even kill the palace leaders, who are the worst offenders of corruption, I find it hard to believe that he would just off random citizens on the street. Now, admittedly, none of this is definitive proof, but I think there's a reason to believe it over the alternative. Here's why. First of all, Yaldabaoth explicitly states that the people give him power, that as long as they desire him and his salvation, he will be immortal. This is reflected in gameplay, as he uses the will of the people to heal himself and acquire his epic golden sheen. It is only when he loses his support that he can be defeated. The importance of this relationship is further established by the fact that the people literally surround him in the chamber you originally fight him in. He needs these people, as much as they need him, and he's keenly aware of it. Also, let's remember, Yaldabaoth is, at heart, the treasure of mementos, which is the palace of the general public. Specifically, he's the representation of their desires. Now, what happens to palaces when the person behind them dies? Yeah, they collapse. Shido's palace provides a pretty good image of that. If the people died, mementos would be destroyed as well, and there's no reason to believe Yaldabaoth would be any different. So not only does he depend on the people for means of empowerment, but also for his existence as well. He was born of them, remember. He was born of their desire for a strong ruler. So what makes the most sense? Him trying to preserve the social order via a mechanism that we've already seen several times before in the story, or him nonsensically destroying the source of his power for no fucking reason, and in the process making every other element of his reformation and ideology impossible. Which is it? Which is more likely? These are questions only a Rhodes Scholar can answer. But I think I'm right. All potentially negative interpretations of his dialogue kind of fall apart when you consider what he is and how he fits into the rules of the narrative. But he is the representation of the people's desires. What about all the people who talk about the end of the world? And how this is reflected in the other outcome of the game, where the world is destroyed and remade? What about their desire for destruction? What about this stupid dog thing from Persona 3, which is supposed to get humanity to kill itself? Okay, as a disclaimer, I have not played Persona 3, or Persona 4, or Persona Q2 Where Are You, or anything like that. But, disregarding the fact that these are two completely different games, with different rules and different thematic focuses, I think there's a valid response to it as well. How many people in Mementos actually, unambiguously want the end of the world? 2, as far as I know of. For most of the others, the concept is of secondary focus to something else, if it's in focus at all. There are plenty of others who put higher priority on ideals of freedom or security or happiness. Some just want to live their lives. Some want to be left alone. And some of these desires contradict each other. After all, you can't bring happiness to the dead. As Shido puts it, nothing can be done for the dead. The only way a professed grantor of wishes could justify killing everyone would be if their desire for death was the only remaining wish of the masses. And even in the prison of mementos, that's simply not the case. With this, I'd like to highlight an obvious truth. In spite of what some state, not every desire can logically be granted. The entire game has been about stopping the destructively distorted desires of those that would harm others and civilization as a whole, or themselves, as Futaba exemplifies. Yaldabaoth praises you for saving her from this destructive mindset as much as he does for you beating Kaneshiro. So what would stop him from disregarding or condemning these particular destructive elements amidst the people's larger desire for peace, particularly when he needs them to function? So why do they continue to say it here? Maybe they haven't had their hearts changed yet, quite like Shido and the others. Maybe that's why they're isolated like they are. He recognizes the desire for death as a problem. I don't know. In any case, there's more to the public's wish than annihilation. That should be self-evident, but just in case, I'll say it anyways. A fair response to this is that one of the possible outcomes of Yaldabaoth's game is that the world is destroyed and remade. In response, I would argue that, to begin with, what you're seeing in the endgame is the world being destroyed and remade. The distortions of the people have prevailed, because again, over the course of the game, the public has failed to learn from your example. You have lost, or at least that's what Yaldabaoth says. Supernatural intervention has been repeatedly shown as necessary to thwart evil. He must take action, and so he does take action. But what exactly does it mean to destroy the world, particularly with a term like remade right besides it? Is it a literal destruction, where the planet bursts into a cloud of fire and gas? Allow me to propose an alternative. Perhaps said interpretation is a bit too literal, especially when we have no clear definition for the world. Perhaps the world simply refers to the social system in which the people live. Perhaps he is destroying the status quo wherein corruption flourishes, and remaking the social system in the world in a way that such evil is impossible. After all, is that not what you've been doing the entire game? Defeating shadows and destroying malignant palaces to better the world? Is not the halting of evil the very essence of reformation, of revolution? Maybe that doesn't speak to you, but remember, Yaldabaoth is a treasure. He even turns into his original form when defeated, like every other treasure in the game. He comes from the masses, and without the masses, he would not exist. Unless we're making the argument that he's somehow forgotten this link between them and his power, which he absolutely hasn't, or that he himself is suicidal, which I see no evidence for, we have to fit that basic fact into what's going on here. Or, in other words, the idea of him deliberately harming the people is, in the context of the narrative's rules as a whole, a bit flawed. What about the water? Won't they drown? Well, if you look carefully under the surface, it's not actual water. And if the people can't see it, or feel it, and it's not physically affecting their clothes, or anything else about them, and it shows no sign of buildup, or existence actually, up to 3 minutes before you kill Yaldabaoth, almost suggesting that happened because you beat him and he lost control, I don't think it's much of a threat to them as is. Again, the thieves have it worse, which is to be expected, as they are the only ones who could even conceivably pose a threat to Yaldabaoth. Yet even they are just imprisoned, you'll notice. Not killed, not put in some overblown torture device, just kept away from the world that they damage. He actually treats them pretty leniently, all things considered. You did try to destroy him and ruin the new world, remember. And though there is a suggestion that this is bad too, you'll see, it's fucking dumb. But what about you, the main character? Yes, let's get to that. And in the process, let's recap what we know about Yaldabaoth with regards to the Velvet Room. Prior to the start of the game, he invaded it, imprisoned its real master, and then literally tore his attendant in two to form Justine and this one. This is a pretty big deal, considering that this master is supposed to be the main authority in the series proper, and that every power sensor goes insane when you fight his blue stooges. But Yaldabaoth crushes them anyways. This gives testament to how powerful he's supposed to be. And this is further supported in the main game, where this attendant and her derivatives are very careful to avoid arousing his suspicion, even as they serve him. After all, we're given no reason to believe that he couldn't just repeat his same performance from before. And then, they finally break their act, right in front of him. They declare that they are not Caroline and Justine, but another existence which was split in twain by Yaldabaoth. They then prepare the very tasteful mechanism by which you've been fusing personas, take a second to glance at each other supportively, step forward, get into said mechanism, and, with your help, fuse back to their original form. They then introduce themselves, explain what happened, turn to confront Yaldabaoth, and call him a fucking butthead. Now, eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed, Yaldabaoth doesn't do anything while this happens. He simply stands there with the same expression, almost as if patiently waiting while the people he ordered to execute the protagonist turn against him and reclaim their original form. Again, this is the entity that forcibly invaded the Velvet Room and subjugated its inhabitants. It's not as though he couldn't take action in this case. But not only does he not stop them, he doesn't even try to stop them. There's no sign of his resisting this development, no scene where he steps forward and gets stopped by a barrier, no sense of urgency in returning Lavenza to her past self. Nothing. You can't pretend you didn't see that. This is debatably the most important scene in the game, where the truth of the past year comes to light. It's the fulcrum between one ending and the next, and he's the most important actor, the one behind everything. His behavior is important, and he just stands there, waiting, patiently. There are only two possible explanations for this. Either he doesn't truly want you dead, or it's poorly written. Let's go with the former. Under this line of thinking, Yaldabaoth isn't actually after your execution. He's simply laying out his cards, like, yeah, this is what I did, and I did it for the sake of the game. It's in the service of being honest with his dealings, in confidence that he's made his point well enough already. Whether he has or not is up to the player. Now, if you decline him, Lavenza tells you to get the other Phantom Thieves from their prison cells, saying they might not have expired yet, and that also seems pretty bad. But if keeping them in these cells was enough to kill them, why would he order the main character's execution to begin with? Whoops! It's almost as if he didn't want to kill you. It's almost as if he knew that the twins would reclaim their original form, because let's face it, they weren't exactly the masters of stealth during their confidant route, and he did that to force their hand so he could drop the act and speak to you honestly. It's almost as if you made some kind of bond with him over the course of the game, and he recognized your integrity and potential from the work the Phantom Thieves did against a backdrop of perpetual darkness and ingratitude. Almost. Oh, and when Yaldabaoth first mentions execution, both of the twins, in spite of having served him for a long time, are clearly shocked and flustered at the idea, further implying that he doesn't actually kill people. The more you think about what Lavenza says, the less sense it makes. And also, her saying Yaldabaoth himself conceptualizes ruin as being his control is simply wrong, so I personally take her reading of the concept with a grain of salt. So, now that mess has been stabbed out a few times, what is ruin specifically? What did Yaldabaoth himself see down the road? To be frank and a bit anticlimactic, we don't know. But in this setting we have observed, in vivid detail, just how far the designs of corruption and exploitative figures have reached, both in and beyond the conspiracy, how much they have warped to the good, and how much both the good and the common have failed to fight against the tide of corruption. While we don't know the end result of this progression, one obvious detail can be inferred. Whatever would come of it is unacceptable. To emphasize my point, ask yourself this. Where would you have been if you never gained access to the metaverse? What would have happened? Your life, pretty much tossed down the drain by the whims of a cruel man in power, condemned right out of the gate in your new community, one teacher in particular actively working for your ruin. If it hadn't been for the metaverse, your life would have been over. And it wouldn't have been your fault, at all. In fact, you only ended up in this situation because you tried to do the right thing. What is one supposed to take away from all that? Ultimately, Persona 5 is the story of a failed society. It's a society where people fail to look after their own, and where freedom is, more often than not, simply an excuse for evil doing. It's a society that is incapable of nuance or adjustment. It's a society where the positive elements of order and peace are fundamentally impossible. Or, to put it another way, as it is, the world is a pretty shitty place. And Yaldabaoth observes this, repeatedly, throughout your fight with him. An implicit assumption of the idea that Yaldabaoth is the ruin is that he doesn't actually care about it as a concept, that the only thing that matters to him is simply the accumulation of power. But this is inconsistent with his general behavior during the final battle and beyond. He speaks of guiding humanity down the proper path of development, and reminds you, repeatedly, of the evil that you've seen throughout the story, the evil that others were incapable of solving on their own, the evil that will bring forth ruin. Even when he's about to be killed, he reacts in disbelief, asking, "Would you steal the people's wishes?" He condemns the moral decay seen in those you're fighting, and speaks to how he shall grant the people's wishes, as well as how their happiness and prosperity is dependent on his success. It's consistent throughout the entirety of his appearance. This is not the attitude of someone who doesn't care about morality, nor is it the attitude of one who is unaware of what it broadly entails, or at least what it stands against. And that is what often gets ignored about Yaldabaoth's character. Regardless of whether you agree with his methods, he genuinely believes that what he's doing is best for humanity, even if he's a bit appropriately jaded by it. After all, lest we forget, even disregarding all that morality crap and looking at it through a purely practical lens, the people are what give him power in the first place, and without them, there would be nothing to rule over anyways. Their wishes are his wishes. He knows them intimately, more than any human ever could. And is his influence really that bad? Lavenza says that he's filling the world with those who have stopped thinking for themselves. But what does that even mean? Although it looks grim from the outside, before you start ruining it, the people seem to be going about their lives as normal. They continue to do their jobs, and continue to express their own desires. And I do think that they're their own desires, unless Yaldabaoth is the type that gets excited for new cell phones. This suggests that, despite its external appearance, outside of matters of justice, he actually has a relatively light touch on things. I mean, it's not like they were saying anything more profound throughout the rest of the game. The Phantom Thieves are super lame. Remember that, Gem? I don't think we're missing out on much. And they're happy, too. They can even be described as hopeful. And that holds even more true in the ending where you make a deal with him. With all this in mind, I don't think there's reason to believe that the Confidants couldn't continue to live in this system. Granted, they're made aware of the visuals from your influence, but if this wasn't the case, nothing would be stopping them from being a caring teacher, or a celebrated doctor, or an upstanding politician that happens to agree with forced rehabilitation. After all, they are, more than anyone else, the upstanding citizens Yaldabaoth comments on earlier. It would be a little strange if he influenced their lives negatively when he didn't do so for the others. If he's not killing these people, as there's good reason to believe he isn't, the one certain negative influence we saw came earlier, when the masses were willing to accept Shido's regime, which, based on his appearance in the Prison of Regression, and Yaldabaoth's condemnation of him in the game as the sin of pride anyways, is not likely to be an issue. The only definitive change that remains after a bit of constructive thought is that those who were very clearly evil are no longer evil, and I don't have a problem with that. Everything else is dependent on his motives, which again, have no good reason to be destructive in nature. With the information available, I think it's fair to say he wants to prevent ruin, and he wants to prevent it by taking control and helping to stop those that would corrupt the social order. Those who, if left unattended, would with their crimes make the positive elements of peace, the wishes of the masses, impossible. There's nothing wrong with wanting to stop that. Especially when you've been doing the same thing the entire fucking game. And in the aftermath with Shido, it's made clear that there are limits to what you can do as an individual. And also when we've seen that it's only through supernatural influence that these people can be brought to justice in the first place. During his battle, Yaldabaoth even acknowledges the fact that the thieves resist ruin with their power as well, but he also argues that this is ultimately insufficient in preventing that eventuality, if for no other reason than the fact that as a consequence of this mission, they're destroying the metaverse and removing the mechanism by which they've been improving civilization from the start of the game. And what is the Phantom Thieves' rebuttal to all this? How do they disprove his claim that the majority are either unwilling, incapable, or outright complicit in an onset of societal rot that will bring forth devastation?
Bullshit! You're just forcing your selfish ideas on people!
Brilliant. Yes, exquisitely worded, Ryuji. That completely invalidates his point. Atticus Finch, who? We have a new master of persuasion in the house, ladies and gentlemen. But what would you expect from the mind behind such brilliant lines as, "How much shittier can that asshole get?" and "We know how shitty you are."
For a god, you're pretty damn prejudiced!
Oh, the truth is so strong I'm shaking in my boots. Of course, he just hates humans. Irrationally. That's it. It's not as though the majority of humans you've encountered in-game objectively demonstrate his point, and that he acknowledges that there are good people as well as bad. That definitely doesn't happen. He just hates humans. That's it. Don't think about it for too long. They have no response. And why would they? Looking at it with a critical lens, every major element in the story completely supports Yaldabaoth's arguments. There are awful and terrible people who make life awful and terrible, and it's only through supernatural intervention that they are stopped and things can meaningfully improve. Extreme circumstances require extreme action. That is the message this story has been presenting from the very beginning. Well, in this case, something extraordinary is absolutely necessary to save the world. Something like you. Something like Yaldabaoth. On that note, you and he are the same. You are both willful entities that strive for an ideal of peace and justice, and you both do what you feel is necessary to achieve that end, even if it isn't always welcome. And both of you can realize that ideal and save the world from devastation. But what about the true ending all three people watching this video have been screaming for the past 20 minutes? That does the same thing, without surrendering your freedom to a tyrannical overlord. Huh. It does the same thing, huh? Huh. Does it? Does it really? Is this the perfect ending that presents itself as being where the people learn to stand up for themselves and create a future that happily marries freedom and security without any foreign intervention or risk of collapse? No, and there are 5 reasons why. First of all, on a meta level, this wouldn't happen, because then a sequel would be impossible. Second, let's remember, the only way you have managed to enact change so far in the story is through your access to the metaverse. Without that, the redemption of Kamoshida, Madarame, Kaneshiro, and everyone else would have been impossible. It is the sole means by which you were able to save your friends and the confidants. Without it, their growth and development would never have happened. It's an incredible power, the means to challenge the awful world around you and achieve a better tomorrow. And then, you're supposed to give it up. Even though you've done substantial, unalloyed good in fighting against criminals and bettering civilization. Even though all the criticisms that have been lobbed against you are, for lack of a better term, false flags perpetrated by the conspiracy. Even though no one in the main group has even considered behaving unscrupulously with their power, to the point that when the general public gets too vindictive, they actually want to back off and let things cool down a bit. Even though systematized criminals can still emerge after the fact, and throughout the game you have been told many times, these people have to go down. Even though it has been a veritable panacea in your life, you're expected to just be cool with it going away as a consequence of the final mission. And everyone is like, yeah, alright, party's over. And then you put a fist through the TV, because what the fuck is wrong with these people? These stupid kids. They don't get it. They don't get that they're foregoing their only demonstrably effective means for challenging the corrupt, and that in the future, if they find themselves in the situation that so many of the confidants were in at the beginning, faced with bureaucracy and red tape and a brutality that successfully enmeshed itself within the system, they'll be up shit creek. No recourse, no one to save them, nothing. Game over. What else do I need to say? Frankly, it's a little amazing how completely they fail to recognize this. If society sinks again and fresh corruption emerges, they will have no way to fix it. The metaverse is gone. The means to salvation is gone. But that's not necessary anymore, the argument goes. That's the whole point of the true ending. The people have changed. That in stealing the heart of the masses, you've caused a true and permanent social reform. You've caused them to take the fate of civilization into their own hands, and because of this, evil will be stopped by them, collectively. That's what Sai says, anyways. The adults will take care of everything. And after all, they took to the streets to remove Shido, right? Surely things will improve from here. No, I don't buy that. And therein lies the third reason. I see no genuine promise of progression in the true ending. Yeah, Sojiro says things change, but do they really? To begin with, the only concrete thing we see the public actually do in this ending is protest to remove Shido. But at this point, Shido has been publicly established as a blatantly corrupt figure who ordered the assassination of countless political rivals for his own personal gain. At this point, letting him keep his position would itself be more of a break from the status quo than having him removed. Not to mention the fact that his confession, which was necessary for that revelatory establishment, only came from the intervention of the Phantom Thieves to begin with. This has no moral value in demonstrating the people's change. All it shows is that they want the government to do its stated job and maintain the status quo, rather than transition to a dictatorship where the rule of law means exactly nothing. And what else is being done? It's not like there's an absence of systemic issues to work with. What about addressing exploitative working conditions? What about the endemic corruption in law enforcement or the legal system? Or did every single dirty cop go away with the conspiracy? What about environmental destruction? What about whatever led to Akechi's backstory? Even if we don't see the full results of their action, which, make no mistake, is not what I'm asking for, there should be signs of specific, material, and more importantly, self-driven involvement if we're expected to believe that lasting change has occurred in the general populace. And there are none. Even if you walk around and listen to people's conversations on this, all you hear is a load of meaningless and tepid garbage, ranging from "what can we do" to "society sucks." They have not developed, at least not in a productive manner. Again, this is the majority, not everyone. But the entire thrust of this ending was that the public improved, not the handful of people that you've influenced mostly through your now absent supernatural powers. It's all the government's fault. I need more money. Is something starting to change? Is something starting to change? Is something starting to change? This is what your epic freedom looks like. This is what you gave up the metaverse for. Bullshit. Bullshit. Also, why the fuck does the gauge go down? Do the Phantom Thieves exist? Even if someone disagreed with what they did from beginning to end, there should be demonstrable evidence to their existence. And this is even more so the case if the change of heart was successful on any notable level. If we were to believe that change had occurred, one might expect that it would at least stay at a high level, at least in the upper 90s. That the public would feel the Phantom Thieves still existed, in their hearts if nothing else. It would have been the easiest way to end the story on a high note, a single piece of definitive evidence that spiritual change had occurred. But this doesn't happen. And seriously, why would it go down in the first place? That's not how any of the other changes of heart worked. There, the effects were pretty much immediate. At the very least, they certainly didn't engage in their condemned sin after the fact. But here, there are plenty of people who obviously still don't care and haven't learned anything. Think about it. That would be like if you changed Kamoshida's heart, and then when he was supposed to confess, he just walked into the gym, copped a feel, walked out of the room and called it a day. It would be fucked up. Maybe the change of heart only applied specifically to make them move against Shido, and now its work is done. Maybe the destruction of the metaverse made the change of heart inherently impossible. Maybe because it was distributed throughout the populace, its effect on each individual person was entirely negligible. Who knows? In any event, what we see as the substitute for your work throughout the game, the respectful adults, is absolutely and entirely pathetic. You know what that tells me? That tells me that civilization is going back to how it was beforehand, where the Phantom Thieves might be a remnant or fun story, but nothing more. Sort of like how they register during the final portion of the game. Remember when Yaldabaoth said, "Now they claim you don't exist"? Yeah, not so funny anymore, is it? Oh, and elements of the conspiracy still exist. Because fuck you. It's plainly evident from the Men in Black trying to track you down in the finale. Who else would they be? They still exist, they likely still hold power, they're still watching you, with you no longer having any tenable means of defense, by the way, and they're still going to work to make society worse off. Civilization is backsliding. Civilization is backsliding. And now, well and truly, you have no means of escape. During the final battle with Yaldabaoth, if you followed his confidant story, Yoshida claims that you're leading a revolution and fighting against him. Ironically, the opposite is true. You're not fighting for a revolution, you're fighting against it. You're fighting to destroy the entity with a real answer, the power to genuinely stem evil and save the world. You're fighting for the status quo. You're fighting for the familiar, because it's familiar. And with that in mind, is the option where you make a deal with him really so terrible? There, you have the means to control evil, and Yaldabaoth gives you a special measure of influence within the city, not just from the Phantom Thieves being praised, but also from a seemingly genuine interest in how you would further influence civilization. More importantly, the innocent people that you encountered throughout the story no longer have to worry about the corrupt rising up to consume them. There remains a mechanism to save them, and not just the ones you happened to run into during the course of the game either, everyone else as well. In this outcome, those that would exploit and ruin the social order are put in their place, as represented by the corrupt authority brought out by the conspiracy being clearly shut down. The negative consequences of the status quo, seen in the game as a whole, are prevented, and from what we've seen here, and earlier, even with his power, the people continue to live as they did before, this time without worry or fear. There's no reason to believe Kawakami can't serve as a caring teacher in this setting, or Takemi an outstanding doctor, or Yoshida an exemplary politician. From what we see, Yaldabaoth keeps his word, the will of the people is respected, and justice is delivered to all. So ask yourself, is Yaldabaoth in the wrong for taking action in a setting like this? If evil would never be otherwise addressed, is it really of greater moral importance to preserve the status quo, even if it means abandoning power and giving the corruption you fought against so earnestly the chance to come back? Is it really morality at that point? Only you can make that decision. If none of this has been persuasive to you, that's fine. I'm not going to pretend as though this ending is flawless or without risks. But it's my view that, all else equal, it is better than the alternative by an order of magnitude. If nothing else, I hope that you enjoyed watching this, and that it encouraged some new thoughts on the story. Honestly, part of the reason I made it was because I seriously couldn't believe that no one understood the rationale behind making a deal with Yaldabaoth. There's a cogent argument to be made for it, I feel, although I suppose at this point you've already made up your mind on that front. There are a few things I didn't cover here, but this production is enough of a mess already, and I've got to move on, with life and death. Both of them. Farewell for now.